Recently, I got a really cool bottle of vodka. It's actually just made with two things. It's made of carbon dioxide, and let's see if we can get a zoom in here. There we go. It's made with carbon dioxide and water. Those are the only two ingredients, and it's an example of some of the really cool things that we're seeing entrepreneurs do with carbon dioxide instead of the gas going up into the atmosphere. And so today we're going to chat about this topic a bit further. I've got James Skinner. He's my colleague at secondstreet.org. James was the lead author on a policy brief that we recently issued with 25 examples of things that entrepreneurs are doing to either repurpose CO2 to turn it into things like vodka or reduce it in the first place and store it safely. So James, thanks for joining me. And I've also got Krystle Wittevrongel. She's with the Montreal Economic Institute. Krystle's done some research on this topic as well, and in particular, putting forward some interesting policy ideas about what can happen, what governments can do rather to support these entrepreneurs that are working on these projects. And then also we've got Karen Chong, who's joining us today. She's a former geophysicist. She's a teacher in British Columbia these days, and Karen has helped us out with this project and a few others, helping us to create some pretty cool little videos. So thank you to the three of you for joining me today. Just in terms of this vodka, I'll give you a little bit more of a background on it before I ask James about some of the examples that he found. This vodka is produced by a company in New York called Air Company. And as I mentioned, they take carbon dioxide that's captured instead of it going up into the atmosphere. And they're then able to use water as a second ingredient and churn out vodka, which is obviously pretty cool. And I think if you stand back and think about it, the chemical formula for ethanol, it's made of three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And lo and behold, you can find those three elements in both CO2 and water, H2O. So it's pretty neat how they were able to transform this. James, I want to ask you, because you did a lot of the research for the policy brief that we did, what were some of the other cool examples of things that you found that entrepreneurs were doing to repurpose CO2?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. There were so many examples of ingenuity and innovation across the board. Two that really struck out to me, though. One was a collaboration between a British and a Canadian company, two countries I'm very fond of, as you probably know. One being LanzaTech in the United Kingdom, and one being Carbon Engineering, which is based in Squamish in British Columbia. They've basically seen a problem in the aviation industry whereby, a lot of people are saying that, well, the aviation industry, they've got high GHG emissions. This is a problem. We all need to start taking less flights. But what these guys have done is said, well, okay, that's a problem. Let's find a solution. They've partnered with other, big corporations like British Airways and Virgin Atlantic, and they've come up with what's called sustainable aviation fuel, which is basically they take captured carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to basically produce ethanol, which, as you mentioned, is three elements: oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. So they basically produce this low carbon ethanol, which basically through a process which completely goes over my head because I'm not a chemist in any way, but they basically lead that to producing a very low carbon form of aviation fuel. So once they grow and expand this operation, it's going to be instrumental in revolutionizing the aviation industry, that airlines across the world can use this low carbon fuel essentially to fly people from A to B. And the second example as well, which I really, really liked as well, is Aether Diamonds. Now, they are a New York-based company, and it's really fascinating how they do things. So, we often see that, the diamond industry, it's quite, emissions intensive in terms of mining and actually transporting the diamonds. What these guys have done as well is same thing. They've sort of, diamonds are very sort of carbon intensive as well, in the sense of their makeup. They're mostly carbon, in fact. So again, what they've done is they've taken CO2, which would have otherwise gone into the atmosphere, and made diamonds out of it, again, through a process which is very, very ingenious and very, very beyond my scope of practice working with you guys. But effectively what they do is that one atom at a time, they basically use that captured carbon to create a diamond, and layer it and layer it and layer it until it actually becomes a full diamond. And eventually what they're now looking to do is basically, I think for every 1 carat diamond they produce, they actually remove 20 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. So when they become a major operation producing diamonds left, right, and center, that's a lot of carbon dioxide that's going to be taken out of the atmosphere. So again, you're seeing this ingenuity, this innovation just from two companies there who are basically taking CO2, which would have otherwise gone into the atmosphere, and not only just preventing that from going to the atmosphere, but solving problems which we have, whether it's in the aviation industry or whether it's like producing carbon intensive products. They're actually using that carbon dioxide to make products and services that we want in our everyday lives, which is absolutely fantastic and just shows innovation across the board.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. It's funny, after you shared that Aether Diamonds example with me, I went onto their website, and obviously people have different price points in terms of how much they like to spend on diamonds, but I didn't feel like the prices were all that crazy compared to what I've heard people spend on diamonds and that. So that was encouraging, that not only are they able to use CO2 to make diamonds, but they seem like they're attainable for at least a decent chunk of society.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you, just were there any examples of things that are sort of maybe not fully happening right now, but could be happening on the horizon?
Yeah, I think one great example of that is Pond Technologies. I think we touched on it in the policy brief about how they're producing food coloring. In the example that we gave was blue M&Ms. Yeah. Just a bit of background for those watching. Pond Technologies is a company who are effectively, they're taking captured CO2, putting it into a giant bioreactor, effectively, that's filled with algae. And of course, algae feed off the CO2. Again, through biology and whatnot, again, over my head, but effectively the algae feed off the CO2. Eventually that algae is pressed down to basically create, these products, basically, not only including, food coloring, but one thing I think is going to be revolutionary for the, the fuel industry in the future is that when they do that compression process, where they compress the algae down after it's fed on the captured CO2, they also have a process where they're creating biofuel. So it's a natural form of fuel that can basically power a variety of vehicles. And of course, we all know that the transportation industry is quite a big emitter here in Canada. But what Pond Technologies have effectively done is said, well, to reduce the emissions, what we can do is not necessarily change the vehicles or anything, but change the fuels that they run on. And again, we're not quite there yet. We don't really quite have the engines which run on biofuel yet. And, Pond Technologies, they're a small operation based in Ontario. They're not a major multi-billion-dollar company, but in my opinion, once they actually, figure out how to make that on a mass scale and, readily produce biofuel available for, all vehicles across Canada or anything that runs on fuel in general, if these vehicles or whatever it may be can run on biofuel and Pond Technologies can produce that on a mass scale, it's going to revolutionize the transportation industry, whereby we'll be able to get from A to B without having to worry about massive carbon emissions, and driving up our GHG emissions, across the country. So I think, that is something that's really something to keep our eyes on, something to look forward to as well. And really sort of, is testimony to how we here in Canada are really working towards, lowering our carbon footprint and actually taking the problem of emissions and climate change seriously.
Yeah, I love that example. One of the things that I liked is that you were able to find a number of other examples in Canada of Canadian companies, particularly in Calgary, that are doing amazing things with CO2. And I'll leave it up to viewers to take a look at the policy brief if they want to read a little bit more about some of the other examples that you brought to light. But Karen, I want to come to you and just ask, you had shared a couple examples that you thought were really cool as we were working on our policy brief. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, there is quite a number. So, I work with high school students quite often, and the ones that come up for me are the ones, how can we relate this climate change issue and like specific to CO2 emissions to those positive stories. So stories I like speaking to students on are things like animal feed, burgers. Where does your food come from? It's always a joke to talk about cow farts, if you will, they're burps. But how do we capture that sort of carbon emission? And so they are, there's work taking that CO2 to turn into animal feed. And it's going through a fermentation process. And, that links into the school system. And I like focusing on things, different things like there's a fish meal. One, we're making fish meal. A Dutch company called Dyco is making dyes from captured CO2 emissions. And, kids love wearing jeans. So, this rolls into their education and really pulls them into that idea of there are lots of positive things being done if you look one step further, step further, one step further. So I see a lot of this work coming together. Other ones that I like to talk to them about are CO2 emissions are being captured and used in fragrance industry as well. So there's lots of them out there that are really positive stories that really motivate the students to think beyond what they are usually presented with when it comes to this topic.
And thank you for sharing with us, by the way. And I'm glad to hear that you're talking to students about it. I don't work in the public school system, obviously, but when I do hear about it in this issue, so often I hear about students just dealing with anxiety. They're having bad dreams at night about climate change. They're really concerned about it. How much appetite do you think there is in the school system, and how much is being taught right now, not like outside of your classroom, in terms of some of these amazing things that entrepreneurs are doing? Like, I would think it would be great to have some of these entrepreneurs going into schools as guest teachers or guest speakers rather, to talk to students and inspire them. Like, when you graduate, you can work in this field and help address this problem. How much of an appetite do you think there is in the system?
You're right that students have a lot of anxiety around this. This is their future, and a lot of them see, that maybe things aren't being done the way they see. So, there's a lot of work with curriculum to really expand students' education on this topic. And again, there's always that push for critical thinking when it comes to the curriculum. So really, this is an exercise of critical thinking for them that addresses their own concerns. And I agree with you, a human library of these entrepreneurs, these innovators would be such an inspiration to the students. And I think there's a big appetite for that, especially in the current climate. And there are lots of students out there who are doing this work on their own with support from teachers. There's lots of teacher and community driven ideas around this. And so it's really, the appetite is there. And I think it's getting there. But, videos like this and the videos we create, just generally, if you're not in this industry, you don't necessarily know these innovations exist even. So really doing that level of communication to, bring that exposure will really push that momentum and build that momentum to have more and more of this. And I think students will really have a huge uptake on being those future innovators and problem solvers for humanity.
Well, that's good to hear. And I certainly hope that the resources that we're producing are helpful to teachers and students as they want to learn more about this. Krystle, I want to ask you about this issue. I know you've done some research on it. You've put forward some good ideas, but I think intuitively when people think about the emissions challenge that we're trying to address, so often the mind goes to the cars that we use every day and the emissions that come from that, maybe the oil and gas sector and that, but it's a much broader problem, isn't it? And there are some challenges with simply this idea of, moving off of oil and gas, certainly in the short term, right?
Absolutely. So this isn't just about the oil and gas sector, which you're correct. Most often the mind goes there and starts to think about, transportation as the number one issue. But outside of oil and gas, there are other high emitting industries like cement or steel, for example. And these industries lack viable options for reducing their emissions. We know that it's not feasible to eliminate about 20% of our overall emissions, which belong to these other heavy industry. So when we think about moving towards other options, we need to shift our focus to removing rather than eliminating our emissions and start to build that capacity. Because in these industries, for example, there's not many options currently in our current context.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, is that you can't always eliminate the emissions, you can't always repurpose them, but there's other things that you can do to safely store it too, right? I mean, we've seen that example in Saskatchewan where they're actually just burying the emissions, and that's one way that you can make sure that it's not going up into the atmosphere, it's staying in a place where be sequestered. You had written a lot about what can be done to support these industries and entrepreneurs that are working on technology to reduce or repurpose emissions. What do you think would be the government's role in helping to support that ecosystem, so to speak?
Well, to start with, the federal government has acknowledged that CCUS, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, do permit us a way to reduce our atmospheric carbon, and that it is the only technology available with the potential to generate negative emissions. So not just eliminating them, but actually capturing them and moving them into some of these projects and products that you have so wonderfully written about. But there are issues, like there's some high front end and high operating costs, which can discourage the uptake and large scale deployment of these technologies. So to encourage and enable commercial CCUS in the context of capping emissions or reducing our emissions, the federal government needs to provide some incentives for entrepreneurs to do what they do best, which is innovate. And so the more we start to deploy these technologies, the more that the costs fall and it becomes more feasible and more relevant to the broader issue of climate change. And so we do know that there is an investment tax credit for capital invested in CCUS that is set to come out in 2022, but the details on that aren't clear as of yet. Currently, they have excluded enhanced oil recovery projects, or otherwise known as EOR projects, because they involve extraction. And so these projects capture and permanently store the carbon while also extracting oil, in essence. We think that those should be eliminated. The exception to this being a project eligible for the tax credit, that should be eliminated. So as to say that, these projects should also be eligible. We should also consider a tax credit that's based solely on performance. So if we look to the United States, for example, they have a performance-based tax credit where the amount of carbon captured and stored is, you get a tax credit based on that for each metric ton. So in Canada, we could do something like that where it's wedded to our current carbon tax, and ultimately the carbon tax or the credit would be based on net emissions for these companies. And finally, we also think that tax credits related to CCUS, whether it be the capital investment or something like a performance-based, they should be a refundable tax credit, as it sort of levels the playing field for startups and smaller companies, such as some of those smaller companies that make some of these great products. And it will ensure that the policy encourages innovation, and it's not necessarily picking winners and losers with this sort of a tax credit. So with appropriate incentives in place, entrepreneurs would innovate to find new ways to capture and store, or capture and use more of these carbon emissions ultimately.
I really liked your second point there about basically just paying these firms based on output, because then what you're doing is you're not really picking winners and losers. You're saying, okay, if you're going to go out and reduce, I think this is what you're getting at, X amount of megatons, then we're going to give you this amount of dollars. And if another company does the same amount, they get the same amount of money. Is that the idea? Or tax break? Is that the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the model that's in the United States currently. It's their 45Q tax credit. And so different projects are awarded different tax credits, but it's all the same for each company. It's just whether it's this type of project or how old the infrastructure is that they're using, that sort of thing. But yes, it comes down to, you've captured 15 megatons, you get credit for 15 megatons, and it's the same across the board. And so you're then seeing companies wanting to innovate to find more ways to do it better and capture more, because there's that inherent incentive for them to do so.
Well, that's great. Like I say, I love that approach, because it sounds like it's certainly a good, fair model. Thank you to the three of you for joining me today to talk about this. And obviously everyone knows how to get a hold of us. Our content is at secondstreet.org. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and LinkedIn. And Krystle, what about the Montreal Economic Institute, if people want to learn more about your research and what you guys are up to?
Absolutely. You can find more on our website, which is www.iedm.org.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you to the three of you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.